I never imagined that the biggest secret I'd kept for nearly 30 years wouldn't destroy my family. It would expose it. You see, my son believed I was just another retired old man living off a small pension. That's exactly what I wanted him to believe. He never knew that a few miles outside town, I quietly owned a storage building that had become worth more money than I could ever spend. I kept it hidden for one simple reason. I wanted my son to build a life based on love, not inheritance. For years, everything seemed fine. Then he met a woman who smiled at everyone, except when she thought nobody was looking. At first, I blamed my instincts, until the day she asked me a question that nobody should have known to ask. That's when I realized she wasn't trying to become part of our family. She was trying to calculate its value. And what happened after that changed every relationship I thought I understood. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Tell me your city and your country in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and it's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if stories about family, hidden truths, and unexpected justice are your kind of entertainment, take a moment to subscribe. There are many more waiting for you. Now, let me tell you how one hidden storage building revealed the true price of greed. People often assume they know everything about an old man after taking one look at him. A faded pickup truck, a modest one-story house with peeling paint, the same worn flannel jacket every winter. They see those things and quietly decide your entire life story before you've spoken a single word. I never bothered correcting them. In fact, I spent nearly 30 years making sure they believed exactly that. My name is Richard. I'm 68 years old, widowed, and retired. Most mornings begin the same way. I wake before sunrise, brew a pot of black coffee, and sit on the small porch my late wife, Helen, insisted we build decades ago. From there I watch the neighborhood slowly come to life. The paperboy riding past, sprinklers clicking across front lawns, children rushing toward the school bus. It's peaceful, simple, exactly the life I wanted everyone to think I lived. What no one, not my neighbors, not my friends, not even my only son, ever knew was that I quietly owned a storage building on the other side of town. Not just a few storage units. The entire property. I bought it 28 years earlier, when no one wanted that part of town. Back then it wasn't considered an investment. It was little more than a gamble made by a middle-aged mechanic who had spent years saving every extra dollar he could. I emptied nearly all my savings to buy it. My coworkers told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My own brother laughed and said I'd probably lose everything within a year. For a while, I thought they might be right. The first few years were difficult. Units stayed empty for months. Repairs always seemed to cost more than the rent I collected. More than once I considered selling the property just to stop the bleeding. But Helen wouldn't let me. She had a way of seeing tomorrow when everyone else only saw today. One day, she'd tell me, people will need space more than they need land. She smiled every time she said it. Turns out, she was right. The city expanded faster than anyone expected. New neighborhoods appeared. Businesses moved in. Property values climbed year after year until that forgotten little storage building became one of the most valuable commercial properties in the area. Today it generates more income each month than I ever earned during an entire year fixing engines. Yet nothing about my life changed. I still drove my old truck. I still clipped grocery coupons. I still fixed broken chairs instead of buying new ones. People assumed I lived that way because I had to. The truth was, I chose to, including my son, Daniel. Some people might call that dishonest. Maybe they're right, but I had my reasons. When I was 23, I watched my own family tear itself apart after my grandfather passed away. Brothers stopped speaking to brothers. Sisters sued each other over furniture. Lifelong relationships were traded for bank accounts and property deeds. At the funeral, people cried. A week later, they were arguing over silverware. That was the day I promised myself something. If I ever had children, I would never allow money to become the foundation of our relationship. Daniel grew up believing we were comfortable, but far from wealthy. And I preferred it that way. He worked after school, paid his way through college with scholarships and part-time jobs, bought his first used car with money he'd saved himself. Every achievement belonged to him, not to me, not to an inheritance. I couldn't have been prouder. By the time he turned 34, he'd built a respectable career as a civil engineer. He was kind, hardworking, and still called every Sunday evening without fail. For years, I believed I'd succeeded. Then one evening, during one of those regular Sunday phone calls, Daniel's voice sounded different. Lighter. Happier. "Dad," he said, unable to hide the excitement in his voice, "there's someone I'd really like you to meet." I smiled before he even finished the sentence. "I think," he paused for a second, "I'm going to marry her." At that moment, I thought my biggest secret was still safely buried. I had no idea that meeting one woman would begin unraveling everything I'd spent nearly 3 decades protecting. I met Vanessa on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Daniel invited us to lunch at a small Italian restaurant overlooking the river. It wasn't fancy, but it was the kind of place where conversations lasted longer than the meals themselves. When she walked in, I understood immediately why my son had fallen for her. She was beautiful without trying too hard. Elegant. Confident. The kind of person who made eye contact when she spoke and remembered people's names after hearing them only once. She hugged me before I even had a chance to offer my hand. "So you're the famous Richard," she said with a warm smile. "I've heard so much about you." I laughed. "I hope only the good parts." She glanced at Daniel. "Only the very best." For the rest of lunch, she asked thoughtful questions about my life with Helen, Daniel's childhood, and my years working as a mechanic. She listened more than she talked, and whenever Daniel told an embarrassing story from his teenage years, she laughed at exactly the right moments. When we said goodbye that afternoon, I honestly believed my son had found someone special. If anyone had told me then that this woman would one day threaten the peace I'd spent decades protecting, I would have dismissed it as nonsense. For several months, everything seemed perfectly normal. Vanessa visited often. She brought homemade desserts. She remembered my birthday. She even helped me replace flowers on Helen's grave one Sunday morning. Those aren't the actions of someone with bad intentions. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The first crack appeared so quietly that I almost ignored it. One evening, while Daniel was grilling burgers in the backyard, Vanessa and I were alone in the kitchen preparing drinks. She opened the refrigerator, glanced around my modest home, and smiled politely. "You've lived here a long time, haven't you?" "Since Daniel was 6. "It's charming." There was a brief pause before she added another question. "Have you ever thought about selling it?" I shrugged. "Not really. It's probably worth a lot now. It doesn't matter what it's worth if I'm not selling." She smiled again. "That's true." The conversation ended there. Or so I thought. A week later, she asked whether I'd already written a will. Another time, she wondered if retirees received enough pension to live comfortably. Then she asked whether I'd invested for retirement. A month later, she casually mentioned long-term care insurance. Each question, by itself, sounded perfectly reasonable. After all, people planning a future together often talk about finances. Still, something about the pattern stayed with me. She rarely asked about my health, or my hobbies, or the books I enjoyed reading. She always seemed interested in what I owned rather than who I was. I tried convincing myself I was imagining things. Maybe she was simply practical. Maybe she liked planning ahead. Daniel certainly believed that. "She's amazing with money," he told me one evening while we watched a baseball game together. "She already helped me organize my retirement account." "I'm glad someone's looking after you." He smiled. "I've never been good with finances." I nodded, but inside I felt a quiet uneasiness I couldn't explain. Not long after their wedding, little things began to change. Daniel stopped calling every Sunday. When he did call, the conversations were shorter. Instead of dropping by after work, he usually said they already had plans. Holiday dinners became negotiations instead of traditions. Sometimes Vanessa would answer his phone and say they were too busy to visit. Other times, Daniel sounded distracted, as though someone were waiting for him to end the conversation. I told myself this was simply marriage. New couples needed time together. Parents had to learn when to step back. Still, there were moments that didn't feel normal. One afternoon, I stopped by unexpectedly to return a toolbox Daniel had borrowed. The front door wasn't fully closed. Before I knocked, I heard voices inside. Vanessa was speaking. Not loudly, not angrily, just confidently. "If your dad ever decides to sell that house, You need to make sure he doesn't let someone else convince him what it's worth. Daniel chuckled. Dad isn't thinking about selling. People change, she replied. You never know. I stepped back onto the porch before either of them noticed I was there. A few seconds later, I knocked as though I'd just arrived. Vanessa opened the door with her usual bright smile. Richard, what a nice surprise. Maybe it should have comforted me. Instead, for the first time since meeting her, I found myself wondering whether every smile I'd seen had been carefully rehearsed. And a question quietly settled into the back of my mind. Was Vanessa trying to become part of our family? Or was she trying to calculate what she thought that family was worth? After that afternoon at Daniel's house, I told myself to stop overthinking. One conversation didn't make someone a bad person. One awkward question didn't prove hidden motives. I had lived long enough to know that suspicion, if left unchecked, could become just as destructive as greed itself. So I made a decision. I would watch. Nothing more. No accusations. No confrontations. Just observation. For a few weeks, life returned to what looked like normal. Daniel stayed busy with work. Vanessa continued stopping by occasionally, always carrying something thoughtful, a loaf of fresh bread, homemade soup, or a small bag of coffee she claimed she'd found at a local market. She never arrived empty-handed. And somehow, every visit drifted toward the same subject. Money. Not directly. Never obviously. She asked how expensive it was to maintain an old house. Whether I had ever invested in the stock market. If I'd considered moving into a retirement community. Whether keeping a large property was becoming difficult at my age. Each question was wrapped in kindness. Each one sounded perfectly reasonable. Yet together, they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while she believed I was outside trimming the hedges, she wandered through my living room longer than necessary. When I quietly stepped back inside through the garage, she was standing in front of my old filing cabinet. The drawer was open. She quickly smiled. I was looking for a pen. I glanced toward the kitchen. There are 3 on the counter. Her cheeks turned slightly red. Oh, I didn't see them. Neither of us mentioned it again. But neither of us forgot it. A month later, my old neighbor, Frank, called me. Frank had worked for the county assessor's office before retiring. He still knew nearly everyone downtown. Richard, he said, this might be nothing, but I thought you should know. What happened? A young woman came asking questions about your property records. My stomach tightened. What kind of questions? Whether you've ever owned land besides your house. I remained silent. Frank continued. She didn't say why. She just seemed unusually interested. Did she give her name? There was a short pause. Vanessa. I thanked him and hung up. For several minutes, I simply sat in my chair. Not angry. Not even surprised. Just disappointed. I had hoped my instincts were wrong. That evening I drove, as I often did, to the storage building. The property looked almost unchanged from the day I bought it. Rows of clean storage units. Fresh asphalt. Security gates quietly opening and closing. Families loading furniture. Small business owners storing equipment. Nothing flashy. Nothing that attracted attention. Exactly the way I preferred it. Most tenants had no idea who owned the place. They assumed the management company did. I liked it that way. The less people knew, the easier life remained. As I finished speaking with the property manager, Linda, she handed me the monthly reports. We've reached 98% occupancy, she said proudly. Helen would have smiled hearing those words. Instead, I folded the papers and slipped them into my truck. Driving home, I kept thinking about Vanessa. If she was searching county records, then she already suspected there was more to my life than I'd allowed anyone to see. She just hadn't found it. Not yet. A few days later, Daniel invited me over for dinner. Vanessa greeted me warmly, just as she always had. During the meal, she casually mentioned that she'd recently become interested in genealogy. I'm trying to learn more about family history, she explained. It leads you to all kinds of public records. She watched my face carefully as she spoke. I smiled. You can learn a lot from old records. She nodded. You certainly can. Neither of us said another word about it. But beneath the table, an invisible game had already begun. She was fishing, and I had no intention of taking the bait. Still, people driven by curiosity eventually become impatient. People driven by greed become careless. I only had to wait long enough for one of those things to happen. It happened sooner than I expected. A week later, I was sitting in the office at the storage building reviewing a maintenance estimate with Linda when my phone rang. "Daniel," I answered, expecting our usual conversation. Instead, all I heard was his hurried voice. "Dad, are you busy?" "Just finishing something." There was a brief silence before he spoke again. "I'll call you later." He sounded distracted, almost nervous. As we ended the call, I looked through the office window toward the parking lot. A silver SUV rolled slowly past the entrance. It didn't stop. It didn't enter. It simply slowed enough for the driver to study the property before continuing down the road. Even from that distance, I recognized Vanessa behind the wheel. She hadn't found what she was looking for, but for the first time, she knew exactly where to keep looking. The silver SUV disappeared around the corner before I could even wave. For a moment, I wondered if it had really been Vanessa. Then I remembered the way she had slowed down. Not enough to pull into the parking lot, just enough to study the property. That wasn't someone who had taken a wrong turn. That was someone confirming a suspicion. I didn't mention it to Daniel. There was no point. He would have defended her, just as any husband would. Instead, I went home and waited. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with an explosion. Sometimes, it quietly knocks on your front door. 3 days later, there was a gentle knock just after 10 in the morning. When I opened the door, Vanessa stood there holding a paper bag. "I was baking banana bread," she said with a bright smile. "I thought you might like some." That surprised me. In the 2 years I'd known her, she'd never visited on a weekday morning. She stepped inside before I could answer. "I noticed your lawn could use mowing," she said, glancing out the window. "I can hire someone." I laughed. "I've been mowing it myself for 40 years. She smiled. "You shouldn't have to anymore." It sounded thoughtful, maybe even loving, but it also felt rehearsed. Over the next several days, similar moments kept happening. She called just to ask how I was feeling. She dropped off groceries without being asked. She insisted on driving me to a doctor's appointment I'd never requested help getting to. When I thanked her, she squeezed my hand. "We're family, Dad." Dad. Until then, she'd always called me Richard. The change was so sudden that I almost looked behind me to see if she was talking to someone else. "Daniel couldn't have been happier. I told you she'd grow on you," he said during one of our phone calls. "I think she's finally getting comfortable." I answered with a smile he couldn't see. "I hope you're right." But deep down, I wasn't convinced. People can change. I've seen bitter people become kind. Proud people become humble. Selfish people become generous. Real change happens slowly. It grows through experience, regret, and forgiveness. What I was seeing wasn't growth. It was strategy. The biggest clue came the following Friday. Vanessa invited me to dinner. Halfway through the meal, she casually mentioned estate planning. "My co-worker's father passed away last month," she said. It was heartbreaking because he never organized his affairs. Daniel nodded sympathetically. "That must have been difficult." "It was," Vanessa replied. "The family spent months arguing over everything." She looked at me. "I guess it's a reminder that planning ahead is one of the greatest gifts parents can leave their children." I took another bite of my food before answering. "I've always believed the greatest gift is teaching your children how to live without expecting gifts." The room became unusually quiet. Vanessa forced a small laugh. "That's a nice way of looking at it." But disappointment flashed across her face before she could hide it. A week later, I stopped by the storage building to inspect several newly renovated units. Linda, the property manager, met me near the office. "We had an interesting visitor yesterday," she said. "Oh, a woman asking questions." I didn't need 3 guesses. "What kind of questions?" She wanted to know whether the owner planned to expand the property. Linda frowned. I told her I couldn't discuss ownership. Did she say why she wanted to know? She claimed her husband might be interested in commercial real estate. I smiled to myself. Daniel knew nothing about commercial property. He'd never even seen this place. "Did you tell her anything?" "Only that the owner values privacy." I thanked Linda and continued walking between the rows of storage units. Everything suddenly made sense. Vanessa hadn't simply discovered the property. She had confirmed that I owned it. The secret I'd protected for nearly 3 decades was no longer completely hidden. Yet instead of confronting me, she'd chosen something much smarter. She was trying to earn my trust. Not because she suddenly loved me, because she believed trust would eventually lead to signatures, to wills, to inheritance, to ownership. That evening, sitting alone on my porch where Helen and I had spent countless sunsets together, I found myself talking to her as I often did. "Looks like you were right again," I said softly. "You always said money doesn't change people." The breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging beside the porch. I smiled. "No, it simply gives them a reason to stop pretending." For a long time, I stared across the quiet street. Then an idea came to me. If Vanessa wanted me to believe she had changed, perhaps it was time for me to let her believe something, too. Not a lie, just a carefully chosen piece of the truth. Because sometimes the only way to discover what lives inside someone's heart is to place temptation within reach and quietly step aside. That night, for the first time since meeting my daughter-in-law, I stopped waiting for her next move. I decided to make one of my own. The older I get, the more I believe that character reveals itself when people think they're close to getting what they want. You don't have to accuse them. You don't have to trap them. You simply give them an opportunity. Then you step back and watch. That was exactly what I intended to do. The following week, I invited Daniel and Vanessa over for Sunday dinner. Nothing unusual. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the same apple pie Helen used to make from a recipe she'd inherited from her mother. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Daniel's latest construction project, the weather, a neighbor who had finally decided to retire. Then, just as we were finishing dessert, I said something I'd rehearsed several times in my head. "I've been thinking about selling one of my investments." I kept my voice calm, almost casual. Daniel looked up. "I didn't know you had investments." "I have one." Vanessa didn't say a word, but I noticed her fork stop halfway to her mouth. "It has done well over the years," I continued. "I'm getting older. Managing it isn't as easy as it used to be." Daniel smiled. "If selling makes life easier, you should." Vanessa finally spoke. "What kind of investment is it?" "Oh, just a commercial property." She nodded slowly. "What are you planning to do with the money?" There it was. Not curiosity. Priority. I took a sip of coffee before answering. "I haven't decided. I suppose," I continued, "it'll eventually go to whoever I believe will take the greatest care of what your mother and I spent our lives building." The room fell silent. Daniel simply nodded. "I know you'll make the right decision." Vanessa smiled politely. But behind that smile, I saw calculations. Numbers. Possibilities. That evening, after they left, I stood at the living room window and watched their car disappear. The test had begun. It didn't take long. 2 days later, Vanessa called. "Hi, Richard." She hadn't called me Richard in weeks. Now she had. "I was wondering if you'd like some help organizing your paperwork. I've accumulated plenty over the years. I'd be happy to sort it for you." "That's kind," I replied. "But I've always managed just fine." She laughed softly. "You shouldn't have to do everything alone." The offer sounded generous. Yet something about it felt less like concern and more like access. Over the next several weeks, her efforts intensified. She offered to drive me to meetings. She insisted on accompanying me whenever I mentioned errands. She asked whether I'd chosen an attorney, whether I'd considered creating a trust, whether probate could delay transferring property. Each question arrived wrapped in kindness. Each one reached a little deeper. Daniel remained completely unaware. One Saturday afternoon, he helped me repair a loose fence behind the house. As we worked, he smiled. "I don't know what changed, Dad." "What do you mean?" "Vanessa." He tightened another screw. "She's been saying we should spend more time with you." I kept my eyes on the fence. "Has she?" "Yeah. She even suggested we invite you to move in with us." I nearly laughed. In 2 years, she'd never hinted at such an idea. Now it suddenly seemed important. Interesting timing. "I'm comfortable here." "I figured you'd say that." Daniel smiled. "But it was nice hearing her suggest it." I nodded. It certainly was. A few days later, another unexpected call came. This time it wasn't Vanessa. It was my attorney, Michael. "Richard," he said, "I received a phone call this morning." "From whom?" "A woman claiming to represent your family's interests." I already knew the answer. "Vanessa?" "I'm afraid so." "What did she want?" "She asked general questions about estate planning." Michael paused. "She also wanted to know whether you'd updated your will recently." I sighed. And what did you tell her? Nothing. He chuckled. You've been my client for 20 years. I know better than to discuss private matters. After hanging up, I sat quietly in Helen's old rocking chair. The room felt unusually still. I wasn't angry. Mostly, I felt sad for Daniel. He believed he was building a marriage based on trust. Meanwhile, someone else was quietly building expectations around an inheritance that didn't belong to her. The following Friday, I decided to move the test one step further. I invited Daniel and Vanessa to meet me for lunch. Halfway through the meal, I mentioned that I'd received a strong offer for the commercial property. The buyer wants to close within 60 days, I said. Daniel smiled. Congratulations. Vanessa leaned forward. That's wonderful. Have you accepted? Not yet. I've been thinking. She waited. So has the buyer made a decision? She asked. I smiled gently. No, I have. She looked confused. If I sell it, I continued, I'll need to decide who I trust enough to carry forward everything your mother and I worked so hard to build. For just a fraction of a second, her expression changed. The warmth disappeared. The patience vanished. What remained was pure expectation. She recovered almost instantly, but it was already too late. I'd seen it. The mask hadn't fallen completely, only long enough for the truth to breathe. As we walked out of the restaurant, Daniel headed toward the parking lot to retrieve the car. Vanessa remained beside me. She slipped her arm gently through mine. You know, she said softly, family should always stay close. I smiled. I couldn't agree more. She looked pleased. What she didn't realize was that I had finally gathered enough pieces to understand the picture. The only thing left was to let my son see it for himself. By the time autumn arrived, I had already made my decision. Not about the storage building, about the truth. For weeks, I'd watched Vanessa carefully. I had listened more than I'd spoken, observed more than I'd questioned, and every answer I needed had come from her own choices. Now there was only one person left who still couldn't see it. My son. I invited Daniel and Vanessa over for dinner the following Saturday. Nothing extravagant, just the three of us. When they arrived, Daniel carried a bottle of wine. Vanessa carried flowers. She kissed my cheek. I've missed you, Dad. I smiled politely. I'm glad you came. Dinner passed peacefully. We talked about work, neighborhood news, and a vacation Daniel hoped to take the following spring. If anyone had walked past the dining room window, they would have seen an ordinary family sharing an ordinary evening. But beneath the conversation, every one of us was waiting for something. After dessert, I stood and walked into my study. When I returned, I was carrying a thick manila envelope. I've been organizing some papers, I said. I thought it was time the two of you knew a little more about my plans. Vanessa straightened in her chair. Daniel looked surprised. You don't have to explain anything, Dad. I know. I smiled. But I'd like to. I placed the envelope on the table. Inside were photographs of the storage building, financial summaries, insurance documents, and property tax records. Daniel stared at them. You own this? I do. His eyes widened. For how long? 28 years. He looked almost hurt. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I wanted you to build your life without wondering what mine might someday become. Daniel lowered his eyes. After a long silence, he nodded. I think. I understand. I turned toward Vanessa. She hadn't touched a single document, but she couldn't stop looking at them, especially the page showing the property's estimated value. I had no idea, she whispered. I know. The room became quiet again. Then I reached into the envelope one last time. I've also prepared something else. I placed another document on the table. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a trust. It was simply a letter. I've written down exactly what I value most. Daniel smiled faintly. I don't need to read it, Dad. I think you do. He unfolded the letter. His eyes moved slowly across the page. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about property. It was about integrity, about kindness, about earning trust instead of expecting reward. When he finished reading, he looked up with tears gathering in his eyes. I wish Mom could have read this. So do I. For a moment, the room felt lighter. Then Vanessa broke the silence. So, she hesitated. What happens to the property? Daniel turned toward her. What do you mean? I just mean. She forced a smile. If Richard has plans, it would probably help everyone to know them. I answered calmly. I've made arrangements. She leaned forward. What kind of arrangements? I've decided the storage building won't be sold. The smile disappeared from her face. Oh, it will remain exactly as it is. She frowned. So, who will own it? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa. No, she said, never taking her eyes off me. I think it's a fair question. I nodded. It is. Then I answered. The person who eventually receives responsibility for it will be someone I believe loves this family more than the property itself. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Vanessa laughed. A short, nervous laugh. That's a beautiful idea. But how can you ever know? I already do. The words left my mouth gently. Without anger. Without accusation. Just certainty. Something changed in her expression. For the first time since we'd met, the warmth vanished completely. So after everything I've done, she said quietly, you're still saying you don't trust me? Daniel looked at her, confused. What are you talking about? She ignored him. I've brought you meals. I've driven you to appointments. I've treated you like family. I nodded. You have. And it still isn't enough? I looked at her calmly. It would have been. She blinked. If it had started before you discovered the storage building. The room froze. Daniel slowly turned toward his wife. What did he just say? Vanessa's face lost all color. I don't know what he means. I continued speaking in the same quiet voice. You visited the property. You questioned the manager. You searched county records. You contacted my attorney. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. Daniel stared at her. Tell me that's not true. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then tried again. I was only trying to help. Help who? Daniel asked. Us. There was never an us in those conversations, I replied softly. There was only my property. For the first time in the entire evening, Vanessa's composure shattered. She pushed back her chair. So what if I ask questions? Everyone thinks about money. Everyone plans ahead. You act like I'm some kind of criminal. No, I answered. I think you're someone who believed wealth entitled you to affection. Daniel slowly stood. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Did you know about the storage building before all this? Vanessa couldn't answer. That silence told him everything. He lowered his head, rubbing his eyes as if trying to wake from a bad dream. Finally, he looked at me. I'm sorry, Dad. Those 3 words hurt far more than any accusation ever could, because they came from a son who had just realized the woman he loved had never been chasing a future. She had been chasing an inheritance. And in doing so, she had lost the very family she claimed she wanted to join. People often imagine that the end of a family conflict comes with shouting, doors slamming, lawyers, courtrooms, dramatic goodbyes. Real life is rarely that loud. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak arrives in complete silence. That night, after Daniel and Vanessa left my house, I sat alone on the porch until well after midnight. The coffee beside me had gone cold. The porch light attracted a handful of moths that circled endlessly through the darkness. I thought about Helen, about how much she had believed in people, about how disappointed she would have been, not because of the storage building, but because someone had mistaken love for an investment. For several days, Daniel didn't call. I understood why. Some wounds aren't healed by conversation. They're healed by accepting that the life you thought you had never truly existed. Nearly 3 weeks passed before my phone finally rang. It was Daniel. Dad. His voice sounded older. Not in years. In sorrow. Can I come by? You never have to ask. He arrived that afternoon carrying nothing but a small cardboard box. Inside were family photographs, pictures from birthdays, Christmas mornings, fishing trips, even the photograph Vanessa had insisted they frame after their wedding. He placed the box on my kitchen table. I couldn't keep looking at them. I nodded quietly. How are you holding up? He let out a long breath. We're getting divorced. There was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. I kept hoping she'd tell me I was wrong. He stared at the floor. Instead, she admitted she'd started asking questions about your finances long before she ever cared about having a relationship with you. The words hung heavily between us. I wanted to believe she loved me. I reached across the table and rested my hand on his shoulder. She may have loved parts of the life she imagined, But real love doesn't begin with a balance sheet. He closed his eyes. I should have listened to you. I shook my head. No. If I had warned you, you would have defended her. You had to discover the truth with your own eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel looked around the house. You know, I used to think you kept that storage building secret because you didn't trust me. I smiled gently. It was never about trust. He waited. When your mother and I bought that property, we weren't buying wealth. We were buying possibilities. I looked toward the old photograph of Helen hanging above the fireplace. We promised each other something. If that investment ever became valuable, we would never allow it to become more important than our family. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. And somehow, it almost did. It almost did, I agreed. A week later, I invited him to visit the storage building with me for the first time. As we drove through the security gate, he looked around in disbelief. I can't believe this has been yours all these years. I laughed softly. It never really felt like mine. What do you mean? I've simply been taking care of it until it was time for someone else to do the same. We walked slowly between the rows of units. Families were loading moving trucks. A young couple was storing furniture before the birth of their first child. A small business owner waved as he unloaded tools for the week ahead. Life moved quietly all around us. This place isn't valuable because of the buildings, I said. It's valuable because people trust it with the things that matter most to them. Daniel looked at me thoughtfully. I think I understand. I hope so. We stepped into the office where Linda greeted us with her usual smile. I've been waiting to meet your son, she said. Daniel laughed. I guess I'm about 28 years late. For the next 2 hours, I showed him everything. How the business operated. How tenants were treated. Why every repair was done properly instead of cheaply. Why honesty always produced better returns than shortcuts. It wasn't a lesson about property. It was a lesson about responsibility. A month later, I met with my attorney once again. This time, Daniel sat beside me. I updated my estate plan, not by handing him instant wealth, but by giving him something much more meaningful. When the day comes that I'm gone, the storage building won't be sold. It won't be divided. It won't become the subject of arguments. Instead, it will remain in a family trust. Its income will first maintain the property, then help fund the education of future grandchildren, support charitable projects in our community, and provide stability for the generations that follow. Daniel won't inherit a fortune overnight. He'll inherit the responsibility of protecting something bigger than himself. When we left the attorney's office, he looked at me with a quiet smile. You know what's strange? What? If you'd told me about the storage building years ago, I probably would have spent my life thinking about owning it. He paused. But because you didn't, I spent my life learning how to stand on my own. I smiled. That's exactly what your mother hoped would happen. That evening, I drove to the storage building alone. The sun was setting behind the rows of buildings, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. I locked the office, walked to the front gate, and looked back one last time before heading home. For nearly 3 decades, I believed the storage building was the biggest secret I'd ever kept. I was wrong. The real secret wasn't hidden behind steel doors or security gates. It was hidden inside a simple lesson that took me almost an entire lifetime to understand. Money doesn't build a family. It simply reveals the foundation that was already there. Some people see wealth and imagine ownership. Others see responsibility. Some see inheritance. Others see opportunity to serve. And if there's one thing I hope my story leaves behind, it's this. Never measure the people you love by what they're willing to receive. Measure them by who they choose to become when they believe there's nothing to gain. Because buildings can be bought. Fortunes can be earned. Even fortunes can disappear. But character is the only inheritance that grows more valuable every time it's passed to the next generation. And in the end, that was the only legacy Helen and I ever truly wanted to leave behind. Before we say goodbye, I'd like to leave you with one simple thought. Sometimes the most valuable thing a parent can give isn't money. It isn't property. And it isn't an inheritance. It's the wisdom to recognize the difference between people who love you and people who love what you have. If Richard's story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever known someone whose true character only appeared when money became involved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can, and your stories often inspire future videos. If you enjoyed this kind of calm storytelling about family, difficult choices, and quiet justice, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you won't miss the next story. And if you think someone you care about could relate to this message, share this video with them. Sometimes, one story can start a conversation that changes a life. Thank you for spending your time with me today. No matter where you are in the world, I hope your home is filled with people who value your heart more than your possessions. Until next time, take care of yourself. Take care of the people who truly care about you. And remember, the richest families aren't always the ones with the greatest wealth. They're the ones with the greatest integrity. I'll see you in the next story.